Hi everyone, welcome to Reason with Science, where we explore the profound questions that shape our understanding of nature. Today we ask, is evolution predictable? Our guest is Simon Conway Morris, professor of evolutionary paleobiology at the University of Cambridge. Famous for his work on the Cambrian explosion and the concept of evolutionary convergence, he has written influential books including Life's Solution, Inevitable Humans in a Lonely Universe, and From Extraterrestrials to Animal Minds. In this conversation, we'll explore why convergence offers evidence for deep constraints on the evolution of life. We'll discuss major evolutionary transitions such as the origin of eukaryotes, sudden explosions of complexity, and the narrow design space within which evolution operates. We'll examine whether traits like intelligence and consciousness are inevitable, why extinction often leads to familiar replacements, and how evolution's predictability might extend to technology, culture, and even artificial intelligence. As Conway Morris provocatively asks, if we replayed the tape of life, would we still end up with eyes, wings, minds, and perhaps even something like us? This episode explores how the physical, chemical, and biological constraints that underpin convergence shape the living world and why, despite its complexity, evolution may be far more predictable than we imagine. This is Reason with Science. Let's begin. Hi, Simon. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Jitendra.
So, working on convergence, or if we in general talk about is evolution predictable? I mean, it's such a big topic. Okay, and I mean, one cannot really sort of describe it in that one go. We have to go really like at the roots of evolution, look at different aspects of evolution. So I thought that let's delay a bit and let's start with the writing itself. So you have written 2 books so far. So
Yep. Sure, carry on.
let's talk about the writing process. So how did those 2 books they came about, and yeah, what's your process?
Well, how do I start? First of all, I need to explain that I'm lucky in as much as in Cambridge we get almost unlimited access to journals. And until quite recently, I worked all the time in libraries. Okay. Now that sounds very old fashioned, and maybe it is, because of course the amount of information you can get now, as you know better than I do, is enormous. In fact, it's almost too much. But also a small confession, and I'm not sure whether this is to be recommended to anybody else on the planet, but the way I work is I take notes and I write on little file cards. I write the paper's title and so forth, and then I write the notes which I need for a particular area. So I might be looking, for instance, at bird song or echolocation or molecular convergence, whatever the topic is. And I end up usually with about 40 or 50 references. And then from that, I sort of distill my argument into a paragraph or two. And I find this a very efficient way of working. But beneath that, and this is something which is very difficult to persuade people is even remotely possible, I'm very much under the influence, if you like, of intuitions. And to be honest, the big fat book, maybe you're referring to that one, The Runes of Evolution. When I look back at that, and I'm not being modest here, but I sort of dip into it and I think, did I write this? It's not that I'm not that it's sort of, an invisible agent doing the work for me, but the whole process of construction and the like is effectively invisible even to me. And there are plans, of course, and I throw away all my notes when I finish with them. But even so, that's really the background to how I work. And it's a thing of sometimes being able to join the dots. But on the other hand, one has to confess 2 things. First of all, the areas, for instance, I published in Runes of Evolution, for example, already much of that information is, if not out of date, at least has been succeeded by a lot of new information. And like you, I simply can't keep up with everything. And then the second sort of problem with this whole area here is that whatever you do, unless you work on something for about 70 years, it's inevitably superficial. To have a really deep understanding of even a single protein, as you will know better than I, the more you look into these things, the more sophisticated they are and the more surprising they are. So I can defend myself by saying I use an anachronistic method, a rather old-fashioned way of doing it, but also I'm aware that ultimately, probably mostly what I'm doing is somewhat superficial, and that's the best I can do.
It's very important because I mean we can start drawing a parallel. I mean in some of my recent conversations, I end up drawing a parallel between a sort of writing process with a scientific method. You know, the way we sort of guide our experiments and stuff, right? And in the same way, I mean we can look at the whole of biology as a book of sort of
Mm,
uh, a book of nature which evolved through the process. You know, of course
hmm.
there were like
Sure,
and in the same way, I mean we can think of a book, you know, the way a book
sure,
evolved, right? I mean,
sure.
of course you mentioned about your flashcards and stuff.
Mm,
In the same way, like there could have been many directions of the same book, you know. uh,
that's right. Yeah,
you sort of
yeah,
ended up with one version of it. But
yeah.
in hindsight, I think we can start explaining the way or you can sort of write another book explaining how that book came about, right?
Mm,
um, and this is what's sort of there is like a caveat when we discuss about is evolution predictable, right? Because now we are looking at this sort of book of nature, you know, the how the biology is around us, right? So how do we sort of overcome this factor of of explaining stuff in the hindsight rather than what really
sure.
happened?
Well, it's of course very very difficult. I think that well the acid test, so to speak, would be in principle that were we to find an extraterrestrial biosphere which had sufficiently, dare I say, advanced life, then it would provide, if you like, a sort of a standard to which we compare things. My own view here would be that I use the analogy, perhaps unwisely, of Charles Darwin arriving in South America, and I think he was absolutely overwhelmed by the degree of diversity there. And at first sight, he might have felt completely at sea. How do you make sense of all this sort of stuff? But on the other hand, as his life progressed and as one learns more about particular areas, you find that a lot of the differences are skin deep. So, not to get too diverted into an extraterrestrial system, but one could envisage a planet which had a denser atmosphere, perhaps analogous to Venus, but nicer. Or alternatively, it's got more light elements, maybe more lithium, something like that. So the gravity is weaker. So, but you can accommodate all those differences because there are all sorts of scaling rules and so forth. So, yes, that would be the thing which, in a way, we would ideally wish for a standard of comparison somewhere out there. And maybe we'll get onto that conversation, but keep it quiet. But I don't think there's anything there at all. But never mind. Well, we'll deal with that as we can. So then the other aspect about it is, I think there are a number of things which give me some confidence about predictability. An important aspect, which you as a molecular biologist, I think, would agree with, is that a lot of what we call in English the heavy lifting, or the Americans, I think, use the word heavy lifting, has been achieved long, long before the protein or similar structure is employed in its new context. And the example I always use, because now having had two cataract operations, I'm no longer seeing through my crystalline lenses, and they're now replaced by plastic. But on the other hand, most people's eyes rely on crystallines. And as we know, those crystallines come in all shapes and sizes, even within the vertebrates, surprisingly enough. And it's pretty clear that they are recruited from microbial systems. So, and one might inquire, why are there so many different sorts of crystallines employed? And to the best of my knowledge, I don't think anybody's actually approached that problem. It seems to me they all do pretty much the same thing. But evolution tells us also that there are often subtleties. There are really what appear to be trivial differences, which actually turn out to be very important for the animal in question. But that's speculation. So this idea of what I've called and others have called inherency, in other words, the basic building blocks. And if I understand this correctly, I'm not an expert, as I said in the health warming I gave at a moment ago. If you go to the prokaryotes, it turns out that quite a lot of the molecular machinery we associate in eukaryotic situations, things like tubulins and actins, but sort of building blocks for the cytoskeleton, are present already in the prokaryotes, but they're being used, as I understand, for different functions. So if a lot of the so-called heavy lifting has been done. That gives you some confidence. And then a related aspect to it is that to the very first approximation, we live in a physical world. So things like gravity, viscosities, densities, gases, all those sorts of things are pretty invariant. And for instance, the argument is being made that in biochemistry, if you're going to have something which is going to be in charge of your energy, you've got to use phosphorus. There's not an alternative. And you may remember all that excitement when they thought they'd found an alternative life form, which was using arsenic. And that was actually exciting for about 3 minutes. But most people would say, well, hang on a moment. And it turned out, in fact, that probably it was overinterpreted. But I can be pretty sure that on any planet, then, the currency of energy transfer is going to revolve around phosphorus. So it's those sorts of arguments. But you can qualify what I say because you know more about this than I do, I think.
No, it really makes sense. And one thing that you hinted at, something called deep homology, right? Where it's like we see the same biochemical pathways working in certain organisms all the way deep down. For example, I'm
That's right.
talking about wind signaling, right?
Yeah.
It's like it's present in all the animal forms.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's a slight sort of possible qualification there because that universality persuades nearly everybody that in fact life had a single origin. And that I think must be the default position. But one needs to remind oneself that there are some cases of convergence. Most of them have little subtle differences which tell you that they've come through a different route to the endpoint we're studying at the moment. But you could make an observation that actually there are some things which simply cannot be any other way. And one might argue that that applies, for instance, to DNA. And I'm not saying this is the case. There are alternatives which appear to work in certain contexts, and I'm relaxed if there are alternatives. I don't care very much, frankly. If it's a genetic code, it's a genetic code. But on the other hand, just supposing that the DNA we have, which is just about invariant, is the only solution in town. And that means that in principle, in fact, things might evolve multiple times. And because they look identical, we would never know. I think it's less likely, but it's worth bearing in mind.
Yeah, and I had a conversation with Dennis Noble, and
Oh,
his
yes,
and
sure.
his view is specifically that there is something more to it, the way the selection works, and in general the way the evolution works. Especially, I mean, he gives a lot of examples at molecular level, because there is like a lot of sort of changes, and I would say that it's also the way we look at the systems. So generally, um, at at let's say the sort of macroecological
Hmm.
perspective, it's been thought that there is like a lot of randomness and chance events. On the other hand, we see that at molecular level that the mutation rates and stuff, they are not really that high. For
Hmm.
example, the DNA polymerases which are used at a bacterial level, they are like 10 to the power minus 9 or something. So the mutation rate is very low in at molecular level, right?
Hmm.
So how do we explain this sort of discrepancy? Is it like just the system level effect? I mean, do we have to look at really a bigger level or system level, or it's really something at the way we look at evolution in general?
Well, I really am not an expert here. I mean, my sense is that, first of all, in a way that Darwinism itself is sort of almost protean. I mean, it's almost impossible to attack in the sense that it's got so many avenues of inquiry that even if one avenue turns out in one way or another, say group selection, which I don't hold any particular interest in. Suppose that turns out not to be correct, and that doesn't matter too much. It's worth talking about, and that's the end of the story. Or maybe it's worth bringing back into the field. And so with mutation, one. And perhaps Dennis Noble would agree with this. It's one part of the equation. That's fine and large. And it's a necessary thing to sort of reconfigure genetic codes. But as you say, by and large, we know that the organism, be it a bacterium or an elephant, is extremely robust. It's very homeostatic. It, even if you abuse it or do all sorts of things to its biochemistry, even if you take out chunks of stuff, it carries on. It says, "Oh no, I won't worry about that." And we might, if we have time, get on to the business about consciousness, because thereby hang some very peculiar stories, which in some way must be linked to the rest of biology in some way. But it's thing. It's not so much perhaps that evolution is multi-level, so it is. The various sort of ways you can approach it. But it's more, and I think this is a view I think fairly widely shared, that there's a sort of cohesion to it. There's a logic to it. And indeed, if you read some of the papers, they do use the word logic. I came across one with regard to an immune system, arguing effectively that's the way you're going to have to do it. So if you're specializing, and of course that's the problem with everybody, there are very few people, Noble, Kunin, people like that, really have an immense range of knowledge. But everybody else really has to buckle down and work on their model system. And it's really difficult to, the woods, as we say in English, seeing the wood for the trees and so forth. You get involved in the minutiae of the investigation. So if the mutation rates turn out to be very low, well, that's okay. That's, one can be sure in biology, everything is there for a very good reason. It's not there really by accident. And the integration of form, the way in which these things seamlessly translate from a complex genetics to a bewilderingly complex biochemistry to a functioning phenotype is little short of astonishing. And I think, as again we say in English, hats off, jolly good, very impressive. Yep.
But then how do we account for randomness in the sort of predictability of evolution?
Well, again, I'm not a statistician, and when you use words like randomness, you, I believe, have to be a little bit careful. It is not. I think it's this is not something where every step is preordained. It's more, I think, the fact that the probabilities are stacked in various directions, and that's why convergence happens. And from a trivial viewpoint, convergence is almost unsurprising, except that, as I pointed out elsewhere, when people describing the many, many examples of convergence, the adjectives they use frequently are ones of surprise. They use words like astonishing or uncanny. And this is, to me, slightly peculiar because, after all, this is Darwinian evolution, at least at one level it is. So, these things have got to function in a particular way. What I think it reveals, these adjectives of surprise, is more that they're actually slightly nervous about the degrees of similarity. Whereas my view, and again, I've mentioned this elsewhere, and I'm thinking other people have unpacked it in much more detail. Ard Louis, I think, has written about this in the RNA context, for instance, is that the total number of biological possibilities is just immensely large. The so-called Alsacer's immense numbers. I'm told there's about 10 to the 80 particles in the visible universe. It's a pretty big number. But in biology, very often you're dealing with 10 to the 200, 10 to the 250 alternatives. And of course, orthodoxy might say, well, you could end up there or end up there. But because the virtual space is so colossal, I mean, we can't comprehend 10 to the 200. It doesn't mean anything really, but we can understand how to operate it. Whereas what convergence on this planet, and I would predict elsewhere, seems to suggest is actually the endpoints are surprisingly similar again and again and again. And we can give nice examples across the range from molecules all the way to social systems. So in that sense, of course, on a sort of day-to-day basis, I'm sure there's going to be variation. There are going to be accidents. There'll be mass extinctions. But again, we probably won't have time to get onto that. But don't worry. My view is mass extinctions are actually fundamentally creative, not destructive. But that's another bag of stories. But in any event, it's really a matter of perspective. If you want to look at a very local level, of course there'll be random events of one sort and the other. The world is a moving target, and therefore things cannot be predicted necessarily. I mean, if we have famous things going back to, for instance, an enormous blizzard, and so of course 90% of the birds die. And it turns out, I believe, that those which survive are actually have some degree of advantage. But even so, it's a very severe filter. And that blizzard is not per se predictable, except in the way that blizzards happen every now and again. So not a very satisfactory answer, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I can see that. But for example, I wanted to sort of highlight a little bit more about sort of these evolutionary transitions, right? Or in other words, we can look at sort of the big bangs of the biology in general, right? So some of the events that we know that I don't know what is the sort of likeliness of those events happening in the nature. For example, emergence of eukaryotes, or even if we go like a step before and look at like sort of origin of life itself, right? So how do we account for these sort of major transitions?
We struggle. I think it's that. I mean, there's a very famous book by Maynard Smith and Ursula Murray on the major transitions in evolution, and I read it years ago. And Ursula have known slightly. John Maynard Smith I met a couple of times, but that's a long history, a long time ago. I think the thing would be well, one could take particular examples and then steer the ship onto the rocks without a lot of trouble. And if we really want to get if we really want to get the ship wrecked, let's talk about the origin of life. Oh dear. And I think it's fair to say that by and large, progress has been slow, and the most successful results being run in hyperclean laboratories, which gives us pause for thought. And there's a very rich field, which I used to read, but I've not looked at it for some time now, with all sorts of potential pathways as to how to get around the various problems. And if I had any money on it, and I'm not too bothered about it, I would actually say, let's go to use a comet, these big icy balls. And most of the time, everything's in deep freeze, so chemistry basically stops. But every now and again, they come close to the sun, everything warms up, the chemistry starts, that's fine. But every now and again, a comet continues, and rather than going out back in its parabolic orbit, it hits a planet. And if it's a planet early in the history of the solar system, which is called the Earth, then potentially you have a delivery of a great deal of prebiotic chemistry in a rather short period of time. Well, there's nothing original about that, but there are, I mean, I've been having some discussions elsewhere in a very sort of cack-handed way. A philosopher got in touch with me the other day about extraterrestrials and so forth. But one of the things is it is possible, and there's a chap called David Bartholomew, who's a statistician, but also, I should say, in passing, a Christian apologist, and he's not embarrassed about that. And he's dead now, but neither am I. But what he points out is that it may simply be that we need a universe of basically the size we see, which is very, very big indeed, for the dice of opportunity to be thrown sufficiently often that, from all other perspectives, almost a fluke, then life originates. You just have to throw the dice, uncounted numbers of times. And nearly always it fails for very obvious reasons, because there's some crucial step which simply can't happen because the acid is the wrong strength, blah, blah, blah. So I don't know. I mean, it's a real puzzle, but like any science, of course, one has to say, well, we don't know at the moment, but don't get too upset about that. Some way thing. The prokaryote problem, if you like, prokaryote, eukaryote, I agree. I'm very far from an expert here. I think one small clue that is not as difficult as it might appear to be from first sight is, as already mentioned, prokaryotes have actually a good amount of the eukaryotic machinery, to the best of my knowledge. And also there's one group called the planktomycetes, which actually have a whole set of convergences in terms of having something which is quite similar to the so-called nuclear membrane, the thing which envelopes the genetic material. And correspondingly, there are things which are akin to organelles. And most strikingly, there's an alga called Paulinella, which actually is more or less in the process of adopting a green alga itself. I think Paulinella is an amoeba, so I'm getting too confused here. But effectively, it's an endosymbiosis in action. And of course, a crucial step is agreed, I think, by everybody, that the acquisition of the chloroplasts and also more universally the mitochondria are things which are essential for aerobic respiration and photosynthesis. But in Paulinella, what we see is all the first steps of what happens. And in fact, it's happening again with all sorts of key things like loss of genetic material. Again, so this may not be very likely, but it's not impossible. And so with the animals, but you were mentioning your own work on a sort of particular brain molecule. Well, as I understand it, in the immediate ancestors, if you like, or the near relatives of animals, choanoflagellates, groups like that, a good part of their molecular machinery is co-opted for things like the nervous system, which is not very surprising because, of course, these are the formation of vesicles, which is one of the things which happens in the synapses. So there too, you've got a building block which can be co-opted into a crucial part of the nervous system. Now, nervous systems don't make animals, of course, by definition, but other building blocks we see in animals, like, for instance, myosin and actins and so forth, all those things have evolved long before. Collagen also is collagen essential to make a decent skeleton. Has evolved several times independently. And so the story goes on.
Yeah, I think it's again like to draw a parallel between sort of writing and philosophy and scientific method. It seems like, like this Thomas Kuhn's sort of explanation about paradigm shifts. It's like in a way that sort of you have one level of complexity and sort of one level of the organisms around, and then you get these kind of sort of big bang of biology, and then you see almost like an explosion of a different kind of complexity around, right?
Yeah, that shouldn't necessarily surprise us. Of course, there's another stumbling block here, in as much as we don't know really, well, I don't really, what happens on other Earth-like planets, in as much as it's pretty clear there are a large number of them. But how many of them have plate tectonics? How many of them develop over time an oxygenated atmosphere? And I understand, but I'm not up to date with this as anything else. One of the sort of things which might have prevented animals from appearing earlier is the way in which the ocean states were constructed, where they were effectively anoxic. They lacked oxygen, which is not propitious for animals. So it could be that part of the sort of equation is understanding Earth history. And I did train originally as a geologist, so you remember a tiny bit about that. But it could there be possible that there are indeed billions of Earth-like planets, but every one is different from every other one. So the old hypothesis of so-called rare Earth, which was put forward by Donald Brownlee and Peter Ward quite a long time ago now, could in fact apply. It just may be very lucky to be here. But I think if you've got the right conditions coming together, I would still have confidence from the perspective of convergent evolution that one would end up with a biosphere, which would certainly have, when terrestrial forms emerge, you'd have rainforests, you'd have flying organisms, you'd have intelligence, you'd have something like a mammal, you'd have something like a bird. It probably is not identical. I'm not bothered about that. That's fine. That's the cream on the top.
I mean, and that's also like a big claim in a way, or at least it appears a big claim. Of course, if we look at all the diversity and the examples that you have described in your books, uh, it makes sense that of course, like many phenotypes, many features, they sort of converge. They appear in the nature again and again, right? But sort of, yeah, as I said, like from let's say this sort of outside perspective, it does sort of feel like that it's a big claim, but apparently it doesn't, right?
Well, I've got a lot of sympathy with that, because, as you can gather, looking behind me, I mean, I read quite a lot of things, and I hope your camera's not good enough to see some of the titles there, because I think some of your viewers might be slightly alarmed. But no matter, I've no doubt there's technology which can do it effortlessly, but that doesn't bother me. But in any event, you're absolutely right that there is, if you like, a scientific way of doing things, but I won't get too stuck into that. But it has enormous strengths, as is self-evident as we look around us. But I think, and this is really going completely off-piste, and I'm not sure you or your other viewers would agree, but I think in some ways these days science is in some degree of crisis. I mean, it's partly the funding, the way it's chosen, the organization of the funding. And we've seen, for instance, in the response to the COVID-19 material, that one could say that people who said trust the science, follow the science, we didn't really end up in a very good position. And I'm not here to talk at length about any of that. But it is that I think the scientific world itself has changed quite substantially in the last 15 years. I mean, for instance, we have this enormous proliferation of journals. And that makes it almost unmanageable, except some of the journals seem to be producing some fairly low-grade papers. So what's the point of that? So no, I'm not going to make a polemic of this, but the wider point, of course, is that in the end, the reason perhaps we're having this conversation, as well as some scientists may be looking at it in due course, and they may well be shaking their head saying, oh dear, poor old Conway Morris, he really is a sad case. Of course, there's a much wider constituency out there. And in fact, I had a delightful email just a couple of days ago from a chap in Munich, of all places, and he was terribly enthusiastic about my work on the Burgess share, very, very complimentary. And it's a pleasure to reply to him. And here's a chap, who's spent months reading in this area, and I don't know what his background is, but I get the sense he's not actually a mainstream scientist. And it's those people, in a sense, which are the most important to talk to say, well, partly we're human, and partly a lot of things we don't know. And also, especially in my case, I don't mind being wrong. I've been wrong many times in the past. I'm not going to lose any sleep on it. I'm going to try and get it right. But, it's so easy to get into a particular mindset, particular frame of thinking. And boy, is it difficult to dynamite your way out of that. Everything seems to go in the right direction. I did a lot of work with colleagues and friends in China. And by and large, it went very well. But the one or two things were seriously wrong. And that was simply because we didn't have enough information. But that's another story.
Yeah, I mean, I have like 2 or 3 things to say on this topic. First of all, I mean, of course, that's like, humans doing science. So, that's just like, of course, all the qualities and stuff that we see around. I think we also sort of incorporate in science or the ways sort of we conduct the whole system. So I think that's that. And in general, you know, and that's why I mean I sort of highlight I call this thing as reason with science, and particularly for this reason, the fact that uh, the science has progressed quite a bit now. Of course, we need like much more progress, right? Um, but I think we also need sort of a good understanding in the society. Like there should be like much more healthy discussion. And I'm glad that you mentioned about the chap from Munich, because it really matters to me as a scientist of 21st century, that we don't sort of look at science of something like elite sort of a class. It's more like a sort of a tool that humans have built.
Sure.
It's like, I would say, language or even like art and music, or it's more like a creative process in a sense. And we need to look at it in a way where this tool can really help us. It should be sort of looked at like in this fresh perspective where it is accessible to all the humanity in a way, right?
No, I certainly agree with that. It is. I mean, it's as you say, it is a creative process,
Yeah.
And also it's also one which requires imagination. And
Exactly.
again, you can ask what are the roots of imagination, and that's a very interesting story, and it's effectively one which people who write poetry and people who are philosophers will probably be interested.
Yeah.
Sure, absolutely.
I mean, I had a recent conversation with Kenneth Catania, who wrote a
Oh
book.
yes, yeah,
Who
I know
wrote
his
a book
work. Yep.
on, oh no, that's great. So this is what he asks, like, where do the ideas come from? Be it art, music, or, for example, when you are doing science, right? And this is sort of a question which no one sort of again can address. It's also sort of a black box where,
Yeah.
of course, they come, but this is where I think also the C word comes into the picture, like, of course, the consciousness and
Yeah,
all
sure.
these forces, right? Um, so in general, I mean, I am also interested in this convergent evolution process. So in general, like how certain traits they appear again and again, and my sort of interest in the topic is because of the engineering training. So I'm an engineer by training, and now
All right.
I'm of course doing biochemistry and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So from designer's perspective, I mean, and at molecular level, I'm sure you are aware that a lot of work is happening where we are designing new molecules, and sort of also we use a framework called directed evolution, where the molecules are designed to achieve certain activity in a way.
Mm.
So what's big, and this is where I see like at least convergent evolution working at sort of that scale where you can start with like different folds and still you can have the same similar kind of function being the activity of,
Yeah.
let's say, a certain enzyme. What's your view on sort of this synthetic biology application of convergent
Oh, I'm I can't say anything about it at all. I'm not being modest now. I mean I know a tiny bit about it. I mean in a certain sense, of course, very crudely, it goes. By the way, I'm not a sort of total fan of Charles Darwin. Don't misunderstand me. But I just get in English we have this useful word called hagiography,
Mhm.
which is typically applied to saints, people like that, and these people have sort of put on pedestals. And it's not that Darwin wasn't a great man. He was a genius. So I don't dispute that. And he had his weaknesses naturally, but so does everybody else. But sometimes I find just sort of there's a bit too much monomania in this area. But that said, and I could talk a bit more about the origin, perhaps, because I've got other ideas about why he wrote it, which are not very fashionable. But in any event, of course, I think it's the opening chapter. My copy's just out of reach over there. It is, of course, to do with artificial selection and pigeons and all that sort of business. And it says, again, a lot for its imagination. I don't know what happens in your part of the world, but in fact, one of the chaps who comes around here is a delightful man, and he cleans our windows. But amongst other things, he's also a pigeon fancier, as somebody who races pigeons. So this is a very interesting sort of human activity. Actually, it tells you a lot more about humans than perhaps you might first think. What other species would think to race pigeons, for goodness sake, or have dogs, or that sort of thing. But so in any event, that the sort of the artificial selection he saw in the breeders of the pigeons with all these amazing varieties, and the same thing, of course, applies to dogs, but not to cats, I believe, for some reason. Why are cats immune to selection? Oh, never mind. So that's, of course, been extended into the very sophisticated work you're referring to. One would like to think that to the first approximation, there'll be benefits from these sort of molecular procedures which could be applied. And that may well be the case, but one has to be slightly careful. I mean, there are all sorts of cautionary tales which go back to the time of the Greeks, Pandora's box, or Frankenstein, and so forth. And I'm not meaning it in an emotive way, but one has to realize that once you have control of various levers, sometimes you have to be careful, to put it mildly. And especially if you're dealing in an area which is perhaps not as regulated as it might be. But again, this is politically dynamite sometimes, and we can all talk of recent occurrences where possibly mistakes were made. But it's not for me to say. I have no direct evidence myself. But I can see the excitement of it. Certainly, it's not, but it's simply not something I really know enough about to comment. I mean, if I might just briefly going back to your Ken Catania, I've read a number of his papers. He does this wonderful work on the star-nosed mole.
Yeah.
Brilliant, absolutely fabulous story. And the reason I came across that, or the reason it excited me so much, is as he points out in a couple of his papers, these extraordinary moles with all these sensory structures on their noses, actually, as he's pointed out, actually in many ways operate almost as an eye. So there's a deep similarity there, and he bring it back onto your show for him to perhaps he did in the last time, but a lovely piece of work, any case. But his thing about art, say, where does all these ideas come from? This would apply even if you were doing synthetic biology. Is you might have a rule book and you might have all your reagents, but what gives you the notion you might work in this way or another? And something which has always intrigued me about imagination, and I'm not a person who can write novels or poetry, which is probably just as well for the wider world. But quite frequently, when authors are writing about the things that they're making into a novel, it turns out, in fact, that the character they invent suddenly takes on a life of their own. And I came across, if I may bore your audience straight away, wonderful example. A few days ago, I'm very much a fan, so to speak, of an English writer called Evelyn Waugh, who wrote Scoop and Decline and Fall and a war trilogy, which is extremely good in my opinion. But in any event, what he said is that one character, I think it was probably in Vile Bodies, but somebody will correct me. But in any case, I think he was traveling somewhere and he suddenly realized that this character had to be an alcoholic. just came out of nowhere. The character already existed, but as soon as he realized this fictional character is an alcoholic, then the whole thing fell into place. And he had to rewrite parts of the earlier thing to explain, the way poor alcoholics always have a big stash of bottles and the like. So what happens in human endeavor, any creativity, including scientific creativity, is in the end you're actually accessing things which are outside yourself, not in a boring way like a laboratory or a library, but the imaginative powers we have, if it's in the example of a novelist or in the case of a scientist, at one level, and Ken Katani, who I've never met, by the way, but I'm a great fan of his work, there's something deeper going on there. And that's why I think, you can then talk to the wider world because they're familiar with all these sort of questions of how do you know anything? How do you trust people? How do you find out how they develop through their lives? All those sorts of things, which are of great perennial fascination.
And do you think understanding of scientific method helps in developing sort of again, your own process to sort of, screen through this, let's say, this mirage of information?
Not very much, I'm afraid. Not for me. Part of the reason being that I've never done experimental work, and not in the Thomas Kuhn sense, but in terms of actually working in a laboratory. I mean, nearly all my published work in journals has been on fossils, and the great advantage of working on fossils is they don't talk back. So you can. I know it's been a lot of fun. I mean, it's been very, very, very amusing, and all sorts of wonderful things have been found. And some stuff is still in progress. I mean, I'm not working on it anymore, but I occasionally see papers coming out on areas I'm very interested in. So I have a slightly different approach in that sense. But otherwise, I mean, I can't make any great claims, but I do read quite widely outside science. And again, as I've said to other people, many times, I'm afraid, just read as much as you can, especially when you're young. Read anything you can lay your hands on. I mean, try and avoid 20th century novels, in my view, most of them. And I have particular authors I greatly admire, but I needn't detain you who they are. But at home, we don't have a television, which is, I think, terrific. But as you, again, see behind me, I read a great deal and I read as much as I can. And these days, I'm going off on all sorts of interesting directions.
So I think at this point of the conversation, if people really want to know who are your best authors, let's keep it for the end so that they can.
Maybe so, if we get there. Sure. Yeah. Or maybe I'll say another time. It's nothing secret, nothing surprising, but yeah.
Yeah. But I wanted to go back to that synthetic biology experiments that sort of we were discussing, and the whole conversation about how do the ideas they come, right? And sometimes it's as simple as like looking at the nature, right? Like when Rich Lenski's experiment of this long evolutionary experiment, which is like just taking bacteria and sort of being adamant that okay, let's continue day by day and look at it.
That's right.
And see how or what happens to bacteria in this sort of long evolutionary experiment. On the other hand, there is another experiment, or there are like few other experiments going on and along the same lines. One experiment is this, again, long evolutionary experiments, but it's called so it's multicellularity or based on cellularity long evolutionary experiment, which is in William Radcliffe's lab.
Yes, I know a little bit of that. Yes,
on yeasts, right? So so that's like, I mean, if I can just describe briefly the setup. So they thought that okay, if if there is going to be multicellular organism, it's just going to be, I mean, from the single cell eukaryotes, it's going to be bigger, so heavier. And they decided to use gravity as a
yes, I remember. That's right. Yes,
pressure, right? And now they are already seeing some of the fascinating structures, the organization of the cells emerging in the lab. So yeah, I mean, like these are the examples where now, of course, and in sort of these kind of setups, it becomes very important to understand what can we predict in the future, right? Do we, I mean, can we see different cells or different cell types emerging in the lab? Like, so this is where sort of my interest lies,
Mm-hmm.
and this is where where I want to put you on the spot and sort of ask you what do you think can happen in these sort of experiments?
Well, I'm a slight disadvantage, and I don't mind that I am. But in the last few years, I've not followed any of this area particularly closely. I met William a couple of years ago at I think a conference, and Rick Lenski's work I found enormously influential because very early on he had a paper in Science, which really sort of showed that at that stage of investigation, historical processes were sort of factored out rather quickly. They were there, but in the end they didn't matter very much. I think it'd be fair to say that, and they had a particular one was a mutation. Oh, I can't remember what it was, whereby it did appear to be pretty well random. It came out of nowhere. And I did a little bit of commentary on that and said, well, yes, that's true at one level, but in the other way, actually, it was a thing to do with an E. coli, and you'll probably remind me of the particular molecule in question. And similarly with the origins of multicellularity. I think. Don't misunderstand me. I think all this work is terrific. It's absolutely excellent. It's so far. It's not a criticism at all. It is that in the case of the Lenski lab, this is of course a model system. And E. coli is absolutely fine, but we know that there are other microbial systems which don't necessarily work in the same way. So that's all right. That's part of the diversity of life. But one would be nervous about extrapolating that to a universal principle. And similarly, the ones on the origins of multicellularity, well, we do know that sort of first stages in multicellularity have evolved a number of times independently, and complex multicellularity, I think, 3 or 4 times. But in any event, again, this is not a criticism at all, but it is, of course, a laboratory process. It is very, very tightly controlled. And it's not to say that the role of gravity didn't play a part in an ocean, which encouraged these things to clump together and then change their morphology. I can well believe that's the case. I say it's very elegant work. I'm all in favor of it. But it's a bit like the origin of life question, in as much as naturally as a scientist, you've got to constrain your system. So you've got very few parameters, which are going to, which can be under control, and everything else you ignore. And that's absolutely fine. That's the way you've got to do your work. So no, full power to them in all respects, and apart from anything else, it's just the fact you end up with analogies to things is I think as powerful as anything else, and analogies actually I think are slightly underrated in science. There are deeper similarities on these things. So that's almost all I can usefully say in this area. Now, as I say, I don't have any problem with. Well, how could I have a problem? But I think but these sorts of work really stand out, in comparison to. I have to say, I look at a number of journals on a semi-regular basis, and really going back to the proliferation of journals, I do find quite a lot of papers not terribly interesting. And I'm not expecting everybody to, write a paper which will get them the Nobel Prize in a couple of weeks. But there's an awful lot of routine work going on, which probably has to be done. But I sometimes sense that there isn't that amount of stuff which is really sort of trying to turn the paradigms around. Most people tend to work within their comfort zone and, don't seem to be encouraged to think, as we say in English, to think out of the box. And this is not a very helpful thing to say. I'm not being critical about this. It's just I observe especially my younger colleagues, and really life is not terribly good for them. It's very competitive. They're always chasing money. There's all sorts of problems with the university funding and all sorts of other things. That's the way the world is. But even so, I think it's a tougher call now than it was when I became a PhD student years ago.
Some people will say that you are expecting a lot from the apes who were supposed to be roaming around in African savanna, right?
Yeah, well, I think we'll leave them there. Leave them to their own. As I wrote, I think if I'd had a time machine, and well, who knows? Obviously we'll probably be through another glacier. If let's say we go 5 million years into the future, we'll probably go through 2 more glacials. I would guess. They're quite difficult to avoid. But assuming that humanity hasn't turned the whole world upside down into one huge farm and one huge city, and I hope that doesn't happen. But assuming chimpanzees survive, I'm pretty sure they're going to be doing exactly the same in 5 million years' time as they're doing it today, which is frankly not very interesting. I find them rather boring.
Yeah,
There, I said it.
exactly. Yes. And that's also like another sort of big bang of biology. I don't know whether we can really call it big bang, but there is, as you said, like a huge difference between our sort of cousin apes and us, right?
Yes, I think it's almost immeasurable. It's, and when you can make a whole, well, you can make a whole set of lists, and
Yeah.
near the top is language, in my view. Again, I'm not an expert on this area at all, and I would agree. How could I disagree that when Darwin was sort of tinkering with the idea that our ancestries were within the primates, and of course, when he was writing, the general sense was, and this may yet turn out to be the case, but the general sense was the roots of humanity were in Asia. Whereas the convention now is they're in Africa. And overall, the African evidence is, of course, extremely strong. But, it's a scientific hypothesis. It may yet turn out to be wrong. I don't mind if it is. I don't mind if it's right. I don't lose any sleep on it. But in any event, what we have, roughly from 6 million years ago is a set of diversifications which eventually lead to the genus Homo, and amongst them are Neanderthals, of course, and Ergaster and Erectus, and these amazing hominins from South Africa, Naledi. Absolutely extraordinary. Maybe 300 things, very, very peculiar in any case. So there's a whole bush of forms there, which is what we'd expect from an evolutionary perspective. Now it seems there's just the one species, and we could argue why the other species aren't there. Some are pseudo extinctions, but evidence of annihilation I don't think is there, but maybe it happened. I don't know. But in any event, somehow how Darwin agreed, as we would, that there is as we would say, a genealogical continuity between us. In other words, it's a lineal descent of species. He would also say that the mental capacities, the differences between, let us say, a chimpanzee or a gorilla, or indeed a crow or a parrot, are ones of degree, not of kind. Whereas I think this is incorrect. And I think there is an absolute distinction. And of course, from an evolutionary perspective, that is very problematic because, of course, there is a continuous lineage, and you can then start to point the finger and say, well, when did it happen? Was it 100,000 years ago, or 50,000 years ago, or a million years ago? But I think what it is from a scientific perspective, is somehow, and it goes back really to imagination, there's a dawning realization in our ancestors that they are, if you like, they have an identity. They are persons. And consequences, amongst other things, are that they will be able to recognize themselves in mirrors. And people say, well, animals can, but I'll come back to that perhaps in a minute. They do and they don't. But also they start to use things like bodily decoration. So at 100,000 years ago, I believe there's things which appear perhaps to have been used as necklaces, ornaments of some form now. Perhaps hundreds of thousands of years before that, there's a red pigment called ochre, which may have been applied on bodies and may have been used as a sort of decoration. It may have been used for other functions. There's no reason for it not to be used for several things. But overall, there's a sort of sense that somehow we are becoming self-aware. And this is the first time this has ever happened. And you can put it in the context of increased brain size or increased size of populations, or you could put it down to a series of accidents, that there are a few technological developments which coincidentally just lead then to further developments. And suddenly you end up in a runaway system, which in hindsight looks inevitable, but at the time would have had no predictability to it at all. But in any event, what I was very struck with, and again, you must forgive me because I'm not completely up to date on this, is are animals capable of what we will call rational thought? Can they work out cause and effect? And one of the experiments which I found extremely interesting involves crows. And what you do is you give them a tube full of water, and you're probably familiar with all this work. And floating in the water, but out of reach of the crow's bill, there's a piece of food. And you can train the crows pretty quickly that if they drop rocks into the test tube full of water, the level of water rises up. and they obtain their food. And this looks pretty impressive. And of course, it echoes the famous fable by Aesop, whereby the thirsty crow cannot get into the jug of water, but by dropping stones in, it raises the level of water. But the trick then was that the first sight, this looked incredibly sort of intelligent. But then what the experimenters did was actually produce a series of tubes, some of which were connected in a U-shaped configuration beneath the platform on which the birds were standing, and therefore was invisible to the birds. But other tubes were also on the same platform, but were not connected to anything else. And it became very clear very quickly that they learn by trial and error. They do not learn by cause and effect. There's something there which doesn't allow them to join the dots. And my own view is there's absolutely no reason for them to join the dots, because trial and error, so-called associative learning, is perfectly adequate in nearly all cases. In fact, we use it a lot as well. But the sort of human intellect, where you start to use words, and you start to use language, and you start to have a cognitive underpinning of the world around you, I don't think really has anything the same in animals. The other animals are intelligent, they're conscious, etc., 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 but they don't have language. They don't see, in my opinion, into the minds of other people. So when I'm looking at you, even through a screen, one gets some sense, sometimes incorrectly, but where you think I should be taking my argument, or whether you find it amusing, or whether in fact you believe this is absolute rubbish. So that's okay. We shall continue on this way. But the point is that we have a theory of mind when we're looking at other people. We can judge to some extent. But of course, a good part of human activity is duplicity and hiding. And related to that, of course, is, in my view, as I've said elsewhere, no animal could ever become an actor. They can never step into another people's shoes. It's just not there. Whereas when we go to the theatre or to the cinema and so forth, if we thought about it for a second, we'd think, well, this is slightly ridiculous. All these people wandering around with prepared scripts in special clothes. What on earth are they doing this for? Well, we know perfectly well where they are, because they are talking about some aspect of the human tragedy, or the human commons, or the human joy, or all three at the same time. And this moves us. This makes us emotionally involved with these people. And animals just don't do that. They've got emotions, but they're emotions mostly of reaction. And almost to bore your listeners to tears, of the many differences between humans and animals, one I came across only quite recently is that amongst especially social animals, and I've mentioned this in passing elsewhere, when they come together after they've been separated, sometimes only for a fairly short time, they are very pleased to see each other. They belong to a cohesive social group, and they recognize each other. And this is fine. They can't, in my view, get into each other's minds. But the one thing animals never, ever do is they never say goodbye. They never say farewell. And I think the reason is that so far as an animal is concerned, there is no future. Whereas you and I, we think all the time in our scientific work, in our social work, whatever we're doing, is what am I going to do next? And what if I do this in a slightly different way? In other words, supposing I have a counterfactual. Supposing, in fact, I decide, if you said you started life as an engineer and then you come into biology, and then maybe in 20 years' time, you'll suddenly say, right, no, I've done this, I've enjoyed it, but now I'm going to reconfigure my life, and I'm going to do something completely different. And thinking about the counterfactuals, and especially in history, which is one of my areas I like to read, is how the world would have been different if things had gone in apparently slightly different directions. And science fiction is very good in this area. It's, again, using our imagination to think of alternatives.
Yeah, I think we can let loose our sort of imagination a little bit more, and think of extraterrestrials in that sense, and discuss a bit, like, if we sort of end up with animals somewhere else on the planet. I mean, how or what's your sort of point of view on this thing, that would they have sort of the animal minds, or in minds in the sense the animals that we see around us, or it would be something similar to what we have sort of evolved?
Well, in principle, if convergence applies, it should apply to something akin to a human. And to the best of our knowledge, there's no evidence at all of any extraterrestrial life. And by that, we can go off in all sorts of directions. This refers to the so-called Fermi paradox, which is this sort of observation put forward by the Italian physicist Enrico Fermi, that he said, where are they? And actually, in his conversation, he was really thinking about the possibilities of interstellar travel. But it's now being absorbed into the wider question of why don't we seem to have any evidence? Do we blow ourselves up, or does something else go wrong, or do we never get to the critical stage in evolution, like the prokaryote, eukaryote bottleneck, so on and so forth? But in any event, there's no evidence in the fossil record, which actually would be one of the first places I would look. Because after all, we've got lots of trackways of dinosaurs, and perhaps one day you might see a jeep track beside them. I mean, it's not very likely, but it's not impossible. After all, keep your mind open. But there are other aspects that give me pause for thought. But again, they are based on assumptions revolving around how we believe human technology will evolve. But given the demands for energy, and despite what I think are misguided attempts to sort of power our countries with windmills and solar farms, that's for the birds, in my view. Ultimately, it's going to have to be nuclear power for the foreseeable future. I mean, you can have other sources of energy, of course, but I think that the principal reliable source will have to be nuclear, for better or worse. But other people will disagree, and that's fine. But in any event, as the demands for energy escalate, so as Dyson suggested, then one would construct a set of receivers around the planet which intercept the starlight of the adjacent sun and are then transmitted to the Earth. And my understanding is, and you as an engineer may or may not confirm this, that actually technologically that's not beyond the realms of possibility. So the point here would be that such an advanced civilization, although the planet itself would not be readily visible even using existing technologies, James Webb and all the rest of it, the star itself would have an anomalous infrared signature. It would belong to the main sequence, but it would have an infrared signature which suggests that somebody is soaking up the energy and re-radiating as waste heat. But the point is that, so it's early days, but a number of searches have been done for these so-called Dyson spheres in our galaxy. But even more adventurously, people have done surveys of hundreds of millions of galaxies where a really advanced civilization, and we must remind ourselves that from that perspective, we're quite new on the block. There are many solar systems much older than our one. But in any event, if something akin to a so-called Dyson sphere on a galactic scale existed, then it too would have this anomalous infrared signature. And indeed, there are a handful of galaxies which seem to show this. But then when you look at them more closely, in each case, there seems to be a natural explanation for it. So there's something, if technology evolved in that way, there doesn't seem to be any evidence for any advanced civilization out there, or even though in principle, one might envisage something like that happening on this planet in maybe 10,000 years, maybe less, a very short period of time on the grand scheme of things. So that gives me pause for thought. I must say so. And so one possibility is, in fact, that yes, there are innumerable biospheres, and many of them are really very similar to the Earth, and they are rich in plants and animals and amoeba and so forth. But the animals are just like the animals here, and that is, as I've said elsewhere, they're growling and hooting and shouting and panting and making all the noises animals make, but they're not making anything which is in any sense of the remotest interest to anybody else. In other words, they're communicating amongst themselves for perfectly good reasons, but they don't have the language which we then use to communicate. So there's something, you could make an argument, which is pretty risky, that actually there's something very peculiar, not so much about planet Earth, but something about humans. Because after all, in their different way, dolphins and elephants amongst the mammals, crows and parrots amongst the birds, are clearly cognitively sophisticated, but none of them seem to be on the threshold of humanness. And then you go into an area which we call metaphysics. So you then have to go way away from science and sort of say, well, what is the nature of the world around us? How is it constructed? How do we access abstract potentialities like mathematics, which is basically invisible to animals. I mean, trying to teach an animal to do elementary maths is heartbreakingly long, and it's really not a waste of time. It's not worth doing. They don't there's no reason for them to understand ordinality, let alone cardinality. It's just no, it's not in their ballpark. And the same thing when I've mentioned in passing, so I go on for too long now, but the business about us recognizing ourselves in mirrors, and mirrors, as we know, as humans, are actually slightly creepy. They're strange things. They're not always what they seem to be. Alice through the looking glass, as we would say. But the point is that there are a number of animal species which do indeed recognize themselves in mirrors, in as much as if you put a mark on their forehead, which they cannot see, they then look in the mirror and look, oh God, what's going on there? But less mention is that these animals are always ones which have been brought up in association with humans. They are what we call enculturated. And enculturated animals are somewhat smarter than their relatives in the wild. So they don't ever become human. But animals aren't stupid, they observe. And part of this seems to be that, indeed, if you do these experiments with, monkeys or elephants or dolphins, but they are ones which have been in association for humans, in most cases for the whole of their lives. So that, doesn't tell me anything which really surprises me. So there's something very, very strange about ourselves, which unfortunately we take for granted. And I think it's the most staggering fact imaginable. We are so peculiar.
I mean, yeah, we are peculiar in that way, and you have done many of these interviews and sort of I would say podcasts and conversations, right? So how many times it happens that sort of it starts with molecules and sort of simple bacteria, eukaryotes, and some sort of simple multicellular systems, and it ends up with, or it converges to talking about human minds and the other metaphysical questions.
Well, it's a fairly well-worn track, but of course, I'm sure you'll find with the other many people you've interviewed, they all have their pet interests,
yeah.
And almost all of them, including myself, of course, would have areas which really I'm not very interested in either talking about, or I'm not frightened about talking about them, but I don't think they're of any great interest. And you can imagine the sort of areas which leave me cold. But in a sense, because my interests have changed from convergence to an interest in the Fermi paradox, and from that the puzzlement as to apparently tomorrow may be different. We don't seem to have any contact with extraterrestrials. But there are radical alternatives to explain the Fermi paradox. One of them is that we actually live in a virtual universe, which is not quite as daft as it sounds, but I think it's fairly unlikely. But in a certain sense, you're of course stuck in a thing. How would you ever know? But there are ways you can test it, I'm told. But the other possibility is indeed that, and this is really an area which goes into metaphysics, if not theology, is that in fact, and here's stuff that I've been reading in the last few weeks, in fact, by various sort of people, but a recent book written by Bernardo Kastrup, I've never met. And he maybe you know him. Maybe you should perhaps interview him if you haven't. And he's written several books, but the book I've just finished reading has got the helpful title, "Why Materialism is Baloney." If you know the book.
I interviewed him.
Great.
I had a conversation with him.
Oh, there we are. Excellent. I should have checked more closely on the. I'm sorry. I go ahead of myself.
That's okay.
But I found that, I mean, the book it needs close reading, and it's very interesting indeed. I'm with him entirely. I agree with his thesis. I think in the end, all there is mind. And the material which we see around us and take for granted is a consequence of mind. It's not the other way around. So even though we think mind is in our brains, as he says, and that's a well-used analogy, it's much closer to a filter. But if this is the case, and then there are other terrifying areas in quantum mechanics and stuff, which I don't understand at all. I don't even pretend to. But if that argument is correct, that materialism is baloney, which I agree with entirely, then this sort of suggests that actually, the reality, if you like, is, as I think he mentioned in his book, is infinitely more than we could possibly imagine. We may just be scraping the surface, and even from a scientific perspective, that should be very encouraging. And I think, again, our problem is that people have become a little too sort of boxed into local problems. But by and large, you're asking to, as a young scientist, you're asking to engage in career suicide if you don't publish 8 papers a week, of which 4 are in Nature and 4 are in Science. And those, of course, are ones which we were quite lucky with our papers in Nature. We had quite a few on the Chinese stuff, and I think they were quite interesting, and that's fine. But that was just one thing to do at that time. But to actually encourage people to spend at least a day a week thinking outside the box, I think it would be terrific. And perhaps they do. I hope they do.
Yeah, I mean, because I think one of the major problem is that how do you model these kind of questions, because I mean, of course you can read about it, discuss about it, and surely, I mean, Bernardo, he comes from this sort of point of view where he looks at closely at quantum mechanics and how it is describing the nature of reality. The other guest that I had was Donald Hoffman, who is describing that, I mean, we as creatures, we evolved to sort of survive long enough to pass on our genes, rather than actually looking at what is the true nature of reality. So of course we have our we have limitation in our senses. It's like we can talk about, I mean, of course, the way our vision works, and some of the insects, the way they see the world, which is completely different in sort of different wavelengths and stuff. So I think there is like a lot going on, but then we'll have to be sort of also patient in a way where we kind of sort of navigate through the problems, and we try and sort of figure out how to pin them down and truly understand.
Yes, well, I agree. I mean, anybody who thinks they've got the answer, I think should be, well, they should sit down and have a stiff gin and tonic, and so, don't go too fast. But on the other hand, it's not quite the same. But I don't know if you ever read Fred Hoyle's The Black Cloud.
Yes.
Science fiction, and right at the end, of course, for people listening, if they're not entirely familiar with the story, it involves the arrival of an interstellar cloud, which is coming to soak up sun's energy, but unfortunately blankets the Earth in darkness, which is rather unfortunate for the people who live here. But some very clever people who, oddly enough, seem to be in Cambridge, but more or less move into something like Bletchley Park, establish communication with this black cloud, which turns out, on the basis of its electrical and magnetic fields, to actually have an intelligence. And that's characteristically ingenious of Hoyle. But right at the end, if I remember the story, what happens is one of the people sort of plugs himself and I'm simplifying here, into the cloud's mind. And basically blows his brain. He just can't deal with this sort of stuff. And I would have to reread this. I've read it some years ago now, but I'd have to reread it. But there is a sense here that there are some of these things, and there were various other people whose names I can't remember immediately, especially in quantum mechanics, where these things are, despite the equations telling you what you need to know, are so peculiar and so odd. I think Bernardo would sort of suggest, you don't necessarily ever be in a position to understand these things. They may simply, and actually if his name's gone entirely, it was a famous German physiologist in the 19th century. I'm not good at names. And he more or less, sort of said, well, we're not going to understand consciousness, so get over it. It's not soluble. Which I think in one level is correct. It's got to be, because all the existing attempts, in my view, which is very restricted, have been failures. They just don't work. And it's all very well talking about mind, but we have an intuitive sense. but there's something else going on there, and it's something which it matters to everybody.
Yeah, I think it's it's a little bit complicated in this, in a sense that sort of how do we define and understand emergent phenomena, right? Because that's also sort of another aspect to it. Of course, I mean, when it comes to materialism, we specifically rely on what is matter, and that's something that we don't really know yet. You know, it's
Nope.
something fabric of reality that we can call or something, right? But we don't know what the matter is specifically.
Sure.
And in the same way, we can sort of talk about, you know, how I'm damn sure like Dan Dennett's work, right, where he sort of describes the termite castle, and how it sort of, you know, it looks, it is an emergent phenomena where individual termites would not know how to build a termite castle, but apparently they managed to make it collectively. So at the end, I think it also depends on sort of how we look at and understand emergent phenomena, and whether really sort of consciousness is a property of brains, or there is something more to it. I think that's the major caveat when we discuss about consciousness, right?
No, well, I agree with that, and indeed, I think the orthodox is it is an emergent property.
Yeah.
But I would be very vulgar and say, if you believe that, you'll believe anything, frankly. I find that view verging on the incredible now. And for various reasons. I mean, one I alluded to in passing, and there are many other examples. And there's a team, the Kellys, who've written on irreducible mind. I don't know if you come across them.
No.
Well, they probably, I don't know them. I've never met them, but they might be people you'd like to talk to. But in any event, there are whole aspects about what humans can achieve and do, which are very, very remarkable. But the one which is quite well known is that on occasion, brain development is severely interrupted, so that most of the skull is full of the cavities, which of course are naturally there, because they provide the cerebrum, energy or fluids and all the rest of it. So in certain cases, these people are quite severely disabled. But in other cases, and I think there's at least one example of a mathematician who had to go into hospital for a routine check or something. They did a scan of his brain, and they said, "Well, we're terribly sorry, you don't seem to have one." So, in other words, it's this so-called hydrocephaly or hydroencephaly, whereby the volume of the brain is something like 10% of the normal human brain. But despite that, this person was fully conscious and fully operational. And there's some much more macabre examples of people who were very badly wounded in the First World War and suffered brain injury, which then suppurated. So these people unfortunately died in the end. But the brain tissue was largely degraded and was, just decayed tissue. But despite that, it's pretty horrible. But despite that, these people continued to act normally. They even though they you wouldn't have thought they'd be capable of any thought at all. And then the final example, which again actually has become a little bit more widely appreciated, especially because so many people living longer develop Alzheimer's and other dementia. And this is no doubt an example you know of as well, is what's called terminal lucidity. And what happens here is in the last few weeks, sometimes the last days of a person's life, suddenly all their memories and everything else come back, and they are practically normal. So here you've got a brain which has been fried for all intents and purposes. It's seriously degraded. The poor person themselves, it's very distressing for the people who know them. And we've all known people with Alzheimer's, especially when they get it younger. It's horrible to see. And that on the last few days, suddenly they're back to normal. So what on earth is going on there? And indeed, Bernardo would do it, and Ian McGilchrist has also written about this recently, and then the Kellys also have drawn attention to this, and a whole set of other sort of observations about extraordinary behaviors, which persuade me that the emergent hypothesis is simply not going to work. And a good try, as they say, but no.
Yeah, I think that's the tricky bit, right? And there is like a lot of so-called neuroplasticity, where so basically all the mechanisms that you describe, they have this sort of neuroplasticity at the end, so
Sure.
the way the brain developed,
Yep.
um, I mean, there are also many other examples where, like, literally people sort of had their, like, a part of the brain was not there,
Hmm.
or even like in some of the accidents where the like a sort of a metal road, it entered
That's
the
right.
skull
Yeah.
and destroyed one part of the brain and stuff. So there are, like, of course, many examples, but then there is also something like this neuroplasticity. Now, how do we again account for that? Whether
Mm,
that's good enough to sort of compensate whatever is happening in the brain, or again, there is something really
mm,
deep in the
mm,
in the brain, or the
mm.
way that the sort of consciousness emerges.
Yeah, that's a very fair point. I mean, in a way, I'm not. I don't work on this here. I just read about it with great interest. It would seem to me that in the end, it's going to be a sort of almost the weight of evidence,
Yeah.
rather than it's not. You the view which tries to accommodate things like terminal lucidity or hydroencephaly and so forth seem to me to be, in terms of, if you like, research programs, more open-ended.
Yeah.
Whereas the sort of idea that the year of the brain or the decade of the brain and sort of endless molecular observations and sort of scanning of one sort and the other seem really sort of not to tell us much more. They don't really seem to get to the heart of the problem. And it may simply be that being conscious ourselves, in a way, we can't actually. It's a bit, as I think Bernardo mentions in his book, if I remember correctly. It's a bit like asking your own eye to see yourself. You
Yeah.
can see it in the mirror, of course, which is the point worth making in an earlier context. But you you can't actually get outside yourself. And if you're in a sense trapped, and I'm putting this very poorly indeed, but you're trapped in a world which is incapable of being explicable other than from a materialist viewpoint, you're never going to make any progress at all. You'll just keep on hitting, as we say in English, you'll keep on hitting the buffers. You'll keep on meeting the brick wall. You'll get so far, but the thing you really want to try and understand will slip through your fingers again and again. And that will be my guess. But if the materialists want to carry on, that good luck to them. I think I wouldn't waste time. But they've had a good run for their money. I'll tell you that.
Yeah. I think the other problem is the simply, like, apart from consciousness, the properties of the brain, right? The fact that we have something called, I mean, of course, it's intelligence and other sort of issues which are related to the brain. So terminal illness is also, like, again, something related to brain,
Mm,
right? So, um, so I think this is where the importance of neuroscience is there,
mhm,
because, I mean, we need it simply to also um, get therapies and sort of drugs and stuff like that. But then there are these sort of deeper issues with the whole sort of framework, right?
mm,
How do we study consciousness, or how do we sort of account for the other things which happen, like something like with anesthesia, right? I mean,
sure.
or simply if we talk about long-term coma.
Yes, very much so.
These are also other phenomena which are very, very interesting.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, I agree. I agree entirely. As I say, I don't. I'm not. Fortunately, I'm not an expert on this, so I
Yeah.
could, I could read freely on in that sort of area. But I'm not. No, I'm not quite sure how one progresses in this area. Other than, it, for instance, no, I can't remember the name. Title. There's a colleague of mine in Liverpool, a philosopher called Stephen Clark, and he's written especially on Aristotle and people like that, and he's very, and it's also on animal ethics and various other areas. But his most recent book, which I was reading at the moment, that I also declare an interest because I provided a puff for it because I like his work very much. But it is, in a sense, what we would call as vertiginous. In other words, it is one which is opening all sorts of possibilities about unseen worlds. And he's actually using as a vehicle, to some extent, science fiction, as it happens. He's a great expert on science fiction. But I think in the end, what happens is that when you're reading these areas which provoke your imagination, you feel as if you're being invited into wider worlds. Whereas I think as a scientist, clearly, as we've said several times in the past in the conversation, one's got to have some sort of restriction on what you're going to study on a day-to-day basis. But my concern is that scientists have become too encapsulated in their own world. So that all the areas which sometimes interest people more when they're getting older, as I am clearly, like philosophy or theology or literature or history, which are of great interest, of course, to other people and other academics. But typically speaking, in humanities, I think it's fair to say they're pretty nervous as scientists. They don't quite understand what they do. And I'm very lucky because in Cambridge, once as I am in a college, so we have about 150 colleagues, all of whom are doing different subjects. So on a day-to-day basis, I mean, today I was talking to a philosopher. Tomorrow I may be talking to somebody who studies medieval music and so forth. So we're very lucky in that sense. But of course, most of what you talk about is just gossip, academic gossip. It's always the way. Why else go to a conference? But in this respect, what one always, and there are a few people I know who've got a very talented Italian, for instance, at the moment, very widely read man. And I have another colleague in a Scottish university with, fantastically widely read. And it's these people, I think, these are the people we need most urgently. The people who are open not only to their own speciality, but know something else about why that might matter as something we want to understand. Because unless you do that, I think things like trying to understand consciousness are really going to be run into the sands. It's once you start to talk about the seeds of imagination, as for instance, a philosopher looks at them. Until you look at that, you're going to be missing part of the argument. You can't do without that argument as well. Or similarly, in principle, to try and understand something about quantum mechanics, as Bernardo does and other people have done, is something one's got to struggle to try and understand. And I think it's one's trying to encourage people to be universalists rather than specialists. And I think that's what we're lacking at the moment, because of the structure of academic life, because of the structure, as we mentioned, the structure of the funding, the structure of the universities. These are things which are not necessarily designed to help, and also just general political correctness and all the other problems we have, where you can't say various things.
And also, I've been thinking about like how to sort of improve the system. The problem being that it is really hard. Also, because who knows, right? Who knows in which direction you should go? I mean, you can say that, okay, these are the major problems that I'm going to sort of sort of give more funding, right? Or these are the more directions. So as sort of policymakers, this is what you can decide, right? In the sense like as a committee, like people can decide. But in general, it's very, very hard. I mean, if you look at the history of science, most of the discoveries, they are sort of chance events in a way. Of course, we can say that there is a sort of convergence. Eventually, we might have discovered that and stuff like that. But this is also like a major issue. Most of the scientists, if we really ask them, and if we really sort of put them on spot and ask them that, okay, how did you come about this discovery? They generally don't know. I mean, it's generally
Sure.
Comes from the data and the observation, right?
Yeah, no, I agree with that. All I would say, I mean, obviously, because I'm really sort of out of the main system now, but what I read about in terms of general funding, at least in this country, in the United Kingdom, is that the direction of travel is not the right direction of travel at all. There's increasing degree of amalgamation. So that we now have a single research council, which on paper, from a bureaucratic viewpoint, sounds wonderful. But again, once you get into areas of what we call groupthink, then it's very difficult to dynamite your way out of that. And then correspondingly, understandably, from the bureaucratic end of things, it's desirable, so it is thought, to have large groups working together. And undoubtedly, there is a dynamic there. And I don't know how it is where you're based, but typically groups of less than sort of 10 and so are getting a bit unusual now. I mean, even my son, who's a doctor and also a researcher, I mean, his group's probably 5 or 6, but on the scale of things at the moment, that's relatively small. But that's fine in a way, but it actually means you just end up as a manager if you're the head of the group. So you spend all your time with personnel issues, and of course, there's all sorts of unhappiness doing the rounds as well. And the sort of Mavericks, and I think it's the case. Correct me immediately, but Bernardo, for instance, himself is an independent researcher. Yeah. He's got a very rich background. Yeah. I'm not in wealth, but just in terms of intellect and so forth. And again, in Cambridge, and I hope elsewhere, we're very lucky because you can pursue your own interests. Yeah. And even if it's regarded as being slightly eccentric, most people are given room to do these sorts of things. They can pursue their own little agendas, and sometimes end up with something surprising. But overall, we'll find the money's being channeled, into various areas. And I'm not going to get involved with that, but you can probably guess the areas I'm thinking of, which it's not clear to me that they're actually, worth so much money being invested on them. But as you say, it's not all these attempts. I remember years and years ago, I went to the Watson Center in the IBM in the States when I was very young. And there they had this magnificent building, and they thought if they threw together these really clever people, and they were really clever, somehow this synthesis would come out of it, that they would, lead the world in innovation. And I think in the end, I believe it really didn't work very well. There's a strange alchemy about how you get people to work together. But by and large, most of the people they're not loners, but they tend to prefer an individual pathway rather than working in big groups. I don't know if there's any research done on it. There probably is. I mean, it's sociology, which is not my area at all. But these aren't very helpful things to say. But why this matters is that you think about the amount of money spent on various areas, and it's not so much the money; it's making the right environment.
Yeah.
And I think, by and large, America and Europe should win hands down in this area. Yeah. We've got the resources and the facilities and everything else. I mean, historically, we have 500 or 600 years of growing these things. And yet at the moment, we seem to have slightly lost the plot. Discuss.
Yeah, I think so one thing is that I tell my students generally that science is a collective process. So if you want to sort of work alone and want to have that, because it's like, especially early in your career, you need to sort of understand these things. Because more collaborative you are, there are high chances, especially in the field like biology, right? I mean, where you need to sort of approach the question from different angles and try and see like how you address it. And this is where you sort of need to also have this collaborative approach and understand that simply, without other humans, you cannot really address some of the fundamental or like some of the basic questions. And so that's that. Then it's about what works in society, because that's also the other important aspect, right? Of course, we can say that I want to know about consciousness, but then people probably are more interested in some of the AI agents and stuff like that, right?
Sure.
Or maybe it's much more important to find the answer to cancer, for example. Mm-hmm. So then like how you weigh in these sort of questions, it also matters. And the other thing is that simply, I mean, my solution was that we just need to increase the funding, right? Mm-hmm. We have like plenty of funds to sort of utilize for other for all the possible questions that we can or we want to address, right? That's probably the only solution. The problem being again, I mean, at the end, beneath, if we are apes, Of course, that's the sort of in-group, out-group thinking, all the wars and
Sure.
the other sort of issues, right? So that's just humanness when it enters in the system.
Sure.
You would see all these dynamics sort of evolving.
Oh yeah.
The bottom line for me is that we need to sort of understand that this is a tool, and it's like really wonderful time to sort of be alive and sort of see the journey, or sort of enjoy the journey that we have, and utilize the tool in a way where, as you also mentioned earlier, that we are the only species who is doing this on this planet, you know and we need to understand the immense power of that thing, that the fact that we are able to do it, and we have all the tools possible to sort of address
Sure.
it and kind of study the nature in this deeper sense.
Yeah.
So I think this collective understanding is the only solution to sort of go at that level where we can uh, start dealing with some of these deeper questions.
Yeah. Well, I could disagree with almost nothing. Yeah, yes, of course, it's a collective enterprise
Yeah.
and the like. And I'm biased because overall I've tended to cut my own path and never had large groups at any time, but for various, partly because I work in China and so forth, working with colleagues there and so on and so forth. So, there was never the opportunity to bring students from this country there and all the rest of it. But yes, no, I think all of that is correct. I mean, again, with the funding, who can disagree? But on the other hand, as we know, even as we speak, the economies are under stress, and it's not that the world is poor; it's actually getting richer and richer. But the problem is that the way the money goes and how it's used is something which must raise people's questions. And money per se doesn't buy anything. It's really how you choose to use it and how you nurture people. And as I said beforehand, what concerns me is that there are various key areas which have been deemed to be of scientific priority. And if it be something like, for instance, cancer, well, who's going to disagree with that? But one might step back and say, well, is it actually the case that although many cancers now, fortunately, are treatable, in fact, in a number of cases, you don't have to worry.
Yeah.
Versus the question of whether cancers themselves are becoming more prevalent,
Yeah.
or indeed if they're becoming more vicious, and there's some evidence, I believe, for that. Then that's a different question. But there's only so much firefighting you can do in this area, and the like. But no, I think it may well be that in 10 years' time, given the promise of some therapies, then it may be that very few cancers are any longer dangerous, and that would be wonderful.
And
Yeah,
this is
I
where
approve of that.
also, yeah, I think this is where also aging part kicks in, right? Because
Yeah.
all some of the diseases we have, right, like which most likely they are a result of the us living longer.
Oh yes. Yes.
And
Well,
this is like also never ending story, because
yeah,
longer you live, of course there'll be more diseases, and that sort of continues the medicine,
I'm very well aware of that. At my age, you're you're telling me absolutely.
No, no, not really, but yeah, I mean that's also sort of
Sure, sure.
a collective,
Yeah,
sort of,
sure.
again,
Yeah.
a
But in
problem.
any case, yeah, what I would do is, I mean, it's a dangerous area because very, very intelligent people, and I don't count myself in this area at all, um, uh, quite often end up with ideas which are completely crazy. I mean, I had a colleague, and I'm certainly not going to tell you who he was referring to, and it's probably used in other contexts. And it was he sort of said, 50% of William's ideas are so good that they individually would win a Nobel Prize. And the other 50% of his ideas are totally and utterly crazy and wrong. And there's only one problem: nobody knows which is which. So, so it is. I mean, I've met a few of these people, and they tend to be slightly maverick-like, and that's very important. But
Yeah.
what fascinates me are these people who just have this sort of nose for dealing with the problem. And then you may be part of a group, and most essentially, if you've got one or two people you can bounce the ideas off, That's absolutely essential. I had a bit of experience when I had a little bit to do with the SETI Institute in the States. But it's very exciting because, we would sit around and brainstorm for a day or two.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure we got anywhere in the end, but I probably helped to refine some of my thinking. So yes, that's right. But we need to fight against bureaucracy, and we need to fight against orthodoxy.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's all I would say.
And I come from a family mostly non-scientists, and when I discuss these issues with them, first question that I get is why don't scientists they enter in politics, or why don't they just go and make policies in that sense, right? I mean that's a different question and probably a difficult one, but yeah, I think that's.
Yeah, who knows? I think again there is. I mean, politics is a very uncertain art, but there are undoubtedly people who have been extraordinarily adept. History might have been on their side, but I think I can think of a number of individuals who, perhaps just because they had the fair wind, were able to sail through the disasters. But a few people I've met, actually one historian, for instance, who it was suggested, I believe, might have stood for Parliament and may well have got in. I don't know, but he was one of the shrewdest people I'd ever met. Very remarkable indeed, and I suspect that he could have even perhaps become prime minister. I mean, it's a counterfactual world. Who can say? But there are these people who have this sort of very deep intelligence, but also know what people are and are not capable of.
Yeah.
Whereas now we seem to have, I mean, especially in the European Union, which we do not belong to, in my opinion, I'm pleased about that, but that's not shared by most of my colleagues, that's for sure. But correspondingly, in the UK Parliament, most of the politicians there are, if you like, professionals. They train to become politicians.
Yeah.
Whereas by and large, I think other people would think that if you had more dentists, more engineers, more historians, more businessmen, people who have their feet on the ground in a way which is linked to something they had to do, which usually had important consequences for the world around them, I would have more confidence in those sort of people, even though they're just as human as the people who represent us at the moment. They're no wiser or nicer than the other people, but they've got a different view of the world. And so do scientists, but yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I just wanted to sort of add that at the end, I think it is about like maybe the scientists are not good narrative builders, right?
Yeah, could be.
So since there are like we were discussing about what works in society, of course, I mean this is where sort of science comes into the picture, how we sort of approach it. The other part is theology, right, which you are interested in, and we won't have enough time to sort of touch upon that. But overall, that's also I think the other thing, right, whether it works in the society or not, and this is where. I mean, of course, it's your point of view. It's point of view of like other sort of, let's say, people, younger generation in general, because what do they see in the society which is required, and sort of how we are going to deal with the modern problems, right?
Sure.
And so let's sort of discuss about that and close at that point. How do you see the role of theology in the society?
Where do I stop? I think probably what is sometimes lost sight of is that humans are universally religious. Now, not necessarily in what a theologian would call religious, but even atheists are deeply spiritual people, in my opinion. I see you have Richard Dawkins' book behind you. And I'm sure he would be able to defend himself in this sort of area as eloquently as ever. But overall, again, if you push most people, it's pretty clear they can't be materialists of one sort or the other. And the usual sort of code name is spirituality. But almost anybody you talk to will either explain they had some amazing experience, which they find impossible to put in words. It may well be in a landscape, or or at a concert, anything like that. It's perfectly all right. And correspondingly, very frequently, especially when people become slightly more confident that they can share a competence with you, they'll say, "Oh, well, actually, there's this one very strange thing happened to me once upon a time." Very often it's involved with families and sometimes death, not always, but something curious happened. And they say, I didn't understand it. It's very odd, but it happened. And they say, I saw it. I tell you. So what they're really doing is they're touching eternity. They've got one foot just forward into these other worlds. And sometimes they draw back rather quickly because it can be very disorientating. But in other times they sort of, in a sense, get a sense of reassurance. And I think that's all I can usually say for everybody else. One can obviously dissect particular religious traditions, and that's fine and large, and that'll take you down particular avenues, which can be very, very interesting. But when you're trying, as you say, when you're, as a scientist, trying to explain what you do, why you think it matters, and why you think it's worth investing in a corresponding sort of way, you can look back at the people who are looking at you and say, I think you probably will find the world is more remarkable than you thought. And don't be surprised if it turns out to be a lot deeper and stranger than you thought it was going to be, especially if you're starting in a career. And keep your mind open. That's the only thing that's the only thing I can usefully say. I mean, obviously, I've got my own religious beliefs, and I'm certainly not going to bore you with those and all the rest of it. But that's really that's what I would end up saying.
Yeah, because I think that's the core part of it, because of course it's it could be your faith, it could be someone else's faith,
Oh, sure.
etc. But overall, what works for the society, or what are the major sort of concerns or issues or problems that we have at present, because one is like how you live your life. That's one thing.
Sure.
That you can get those inspirations from anywhere, from science fiction, from other sources, etc. The second thing is how we sort of build the society, and this is where that sort of again collective thinking kicks in, and where we need to sort of come together, discuss, and figure out our ways. Of course, our ancestors, they were also not like that stupid in a way, and they had a lot of wisdom as well.
Oh, yeah.
But of course, they also had a lot of crap notions, and we need to sort of understand and discuss and balance and figure out our way to sort of how we carve the function of the society. And with that, I would say thank you so much for accepting the invitation. It was great. Thank you.
Oh, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you very much indeed. I'm most grateful. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.